Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. When the Federal Reserve loses its independence, it risks becoming subject to political pressures, leading to potentially higher or more volatile inflation, increased borrowing costs like mortgage and credit cards, and market instability, as well as a loss of credibility as politicians push for policies that boost short-term growth and their approval ratings at the expense of long-term economic stability. Following a criminal probe, Fed Chair Jerome Powell issued a warning in which he explained that he is being prosecuted quite literally for refusing to submit to the pressure coming from the White House to lower interest rates. And all of us should be deeply, deeply concerned when we hear this. Watch this clip first, and then we'll discuss the threats that this unprecedented attack on the Fed's independence means. Take a look.
Good evening. On Friday, the Department of Justice served the Federal Reserve with grand jury subpoenas, threatening a criminal indictment related to my testimony before the Senate Banking Committee last June. That testimony concerned in part a multi-year project to renovate historic Federal Reserve office buildings. I have deep respect for the rule of law and for accountability in our democracy. No one, certainly not the chair of the Federal Reserve, is above the law. But this unprecedented action should be seen in the broader context of the administration's threats and ongoing pressure. This new threat is not about my testimony last June or about the renovation of the Federal Reserve buildings. It is not about Congress's oversight role. The Fed, through testimony and other public disclosures, made every effort to keep Congress informed about the renovation project. Those are pretexts. The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president. This is about whether the Fed will be able to continue to set interest rates based on evidence and economic conditions, or whether instead monetary policy will be directed by political pressure or intimidation. I have served at the Federal Reserve under 4 administrations, Republicans and Democrats alike. In every case, I have carried out my duties without political fear or favor, focused solely on our mandate of price stability and maximum employment. Public service sometimes requires standing firm in the face of threats. I will continue to do the job the Senate confirmed me to do, with integrity and a commitment to serving the American people. Thank you.
Jerome Powell's term as chair of the Federal Reserve ends in May of 2026, and that date may turn out to be one of the most important inflection points in modern economic history. When Powell's term expires, President Trump will be able to appoint a new Fed chair of his own choosing. Now, on its own, that might sound routine. Presidents appoint Fed chairs all the time, but in this case, the broader context matters. Taken together with the president's repeated and systemic attacks on the Fed, his pressure on Powell to resign, and his efforts to influence the composition of the Fed's board, the odds are rising that the Federal Reserve could lose its independence and effectively come under presidential control. Under Trump, the destruction of institutions domestically and internationally, that is part of an agenda, and it's not collateral damage as some may perceive it to be, and that destruction of institutions without a cohesive plan, a well-designed plan, typically leads to chaos and lucrative opportunities for a very small group of powerful individuals to profit. So if the Fed loses its independence, it would be a very big deal, and not just for everyday Americans, but for the stability of the global financial system. An independent central bank is one of the core institutional pillars that underpins confidence in the United States economy and the US dollar. Removing that independence introduces risks that extend far beyond interest rates or monthly inflation reports. At the very basic level, a Fed that answers directly to the president would be far more likely to pursue overly expansionary monetary policy. Now, what does that mean? Well, the political incentive is very obvious here, isn't it? Lower interest rates feel good in the short term, and I'm sure that Trump's base would absolutely love it, and they would call it a new triumph. Lower rates make borrowing cheaper and can temporarily boost economic growth. But look, even Kevin Hassett, the director of the National Economic Council and one of the president's own top contenders to replace Powell, has openly acknowledged that losing independence for the Federal Reserve is actually a recipe for inflation and economic misery. In other words, the short-term political benefits come with severe, very severe long-term economic costs. Now, is there a long-term risk here? And yes, there are many, many risks, and they are very real. The long-term risk is that the United States enters a period of sustained stagflation, which is defined by weak growth combined with persistent inflation alongside rising financial instability. And because the United States sits at the very center of the global financial system, instability here does not stay confined to the United States of America. It ripples outward, raising the risk of a global financial crisis as well as accelerating de-dollarization. Because who would want to rely on the currency that is not only systemically weaponized, but is also now heavily politicized too? Who would want that? Nobody. And so now what happens if the Fed loses its independence and becomes a political tool? That is a very good question. There are several risks that I want to walk you through in this video. First, there is an increased risk of bank runs. Banks do not keep all deposited dollars on hand, as you know very well. They lend them out to earn profits. That's how banks make money. This is normal banking. But if confidence erodes, depositors may worry that banks won't have their money when they need it, when they want it. And if enough people act on that fear or on that perception, a bank run may and likely will occur. A politicized Fed that prioritizes short-term growth over stability increases the odds of these kinds of failures. Second is inflation risk. Expansionary monetary policy increases the money supply by effectively enabling banks to lend more. Money supply, as I discussed in one of my recent videos, has already been increasing. Thus, it creates inflationary pressure in the economy. If the supply of money grows faster than real economic output and people spend that money rather than save it, prices rise. There's no other way around it. Prices will rise. Inflation erodes the purchasing power of dollars. Your paycheck buys less, your savings are worth less, and long-term planning becomes impossible. Third is systemic risk. Low interest rates encourage speculation and risk-taking. Over time, this may lead to complex webs of interconnected debt. When a major player defaults, those that are interconnected with them can trigger cascading failures. This is how localized problems turn into full-blown financial crises. And we learned that very well back in 2008, didn't we? Then there is a currency risk too. The United States dollar sits at the very heart of the global financial system. Of course, its role has been weakening, as I oftenly describe and explain in my videos, but it is still the reserve currency of the world. Central banks around the world hold treasuries. U.S. financial institutions dominate global markets, and that position rests not only on trade volume, but also on trust. Trust in the stability of the United States economy, in lower inflation and strong institutions. Undermine those, as we now do, and the dollar's privileged status comes into question. It is directly at risk now. President Trump has been openly pressuring the Fed to cut rates, arguing that they have been too high for too long. He posts multiple messages to Fed Chair Jerome Powell on X and on his social platform Truth Social, calling for Powell to cut rates. But while recent labor market data suggests that the economy is slowing and rate cuts might be justified on economic grounds, although many still do oppose that, the issue is not whether rates go down, it's who decides, when, and why. A Fed controlled by the president would amplify every single risk that I just walked you through and that is already present in our system. The Fed has two core responsibilities, as you know very well, which are managing monetary policy to balance inflation and employment, and also regulating systemic risk to maintaining financial stability in the country. Loose money combined with weak regulation can produce short-term growth, sure, which will of course benefit political ambitions, but it would come at a long-term cost, and that is probably a disaster in the long run. Taking together these forces that I just described very briefly and on a very high level paint a troubling picture. If the Fed loses its independence, as it's poised to do, the risks of inflation, instability, dollar weakness, and global disruption rise sharply. Short-term gains may be followed by long-term pain, and because the United States sits at the very center of the global system, the consequences would not stop at America's borders. I will definitely keep you posted on Substack, Patreon, as well as on my YouTube channel, and this is a very, very fascinating topic. I think it has to do with every single one of us here in the United States, as well as those who live abroad, so staying on top of it is something that I would definitely recommend you do. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for joining me for a new video today. Support my work if you haven't already. I appreciate every single one of you who has become a paid subscriber on YouTube, on Patreon, and Substack. Thank you so much for your support, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day. I will see you back here tomorrow. Take care.